Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the history, the psychology, and the evolution of a truly deadly political tool. Look, assassination is a pretty grim subject, for sure, but understanding exactly how and why these events happen, it actually provides incredible insight into human history and global power dynamics. So let's just jump right in and break down the anatomy of this dark art.
Okay, let's quickly run through our agenda. We're going to journey all the way from ancient linguistic roots right up to complex modern legal doctrines. We'll define the dark art, look at it as a weapon of power, get inside the assassin's mind, track the evolution of lethal tactics, tackle the targeted killing debate, and wrap up with shields and countermeasures.
All right, Section 1, Defining the Dark Art. Let's look at exactly what constitutes this act and where the terminology actually originated.
So what are we actually talking about here? By definition, an assassination is the willful killing, usually by a sudden or secret attack, of a prominent person. And it's almost always for political, social, or ideological reasons. The really crucial takeaway here is that this isn't just some random impulsive murder, right? It's a highly targeted strike meant to generate a massive ripple effect. It's literally violence utilized as a deliberate tool to shift power or ideology.
And the word itself has a fascinating backstory. It actually traces back to the ruins of Masyaf Castle in Syria. This place was the historical headquarters of the 11th century Nizari Ismaili Order of Assassins. Founded by Hassani Sabah, they operated out of massive stone strongholds just like this one, across the Levant. And their main goal? To eliminate members of the Abbasid, Seljuk, and Christian Crusader elite for very specific political and religious reasons. It was actually this highly specialized medieval group that effectively gave us the exact word we use today.
Moving on to Section 2, a weapon of power. Let's see how this builds across centuries of human history as a really grim tool of power politics.
It's wild to realize just how widely this lethal tactic has been utilized globally, pretty much across all recorded history. I mean, we're starting way back in the 23rd century BC with Pharaoh Teti of Egypt, who's actually thought to be the earliest known victim. Then you hit the famous ancient examples, Julius Caesar in 44 BC. Fast forward a bit to 1914, and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand literally ignites the First World War. Then we see the really tragic losses of the 1960s, like Martin Luther King Jr., and that brings us right up to modern conflicts, like the 2026 targeted airstrike in Tehran that killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. The timeline reveals one absolutely undeniable fact. This is an enduring fixture of human conflict.
And no matter the era, powerful leaders were just consistently vulnerable, whether we're looking at Abraham Lincoln in 19th century America or William the Silent in the 16th century Netherlands. Now, obviously, there are vast differences in those societies, right? Centuries of time between them. But the fundamental mechanic of the act, that sudden, close-quarters attack on a high-profile leader, it remains just chillingly identical.
All right, Section 3, Inside the Assassin's Mind. Let's dive into some actual data to strip away the Hollywood myths about who commits these acts and why.
Think about the assassins you usually see in the movies. They're almost always depicted as super impulsive, chaotic, maybe acting in some sudden crime of passion. Well, scratch that. Surprisingly, a major U.S. study covering the second half of the 20th century shows that 80% of perpetrators actually spend copious amounts of time planning and preparing for their attempts. And get this, when those attempts were successful, that number jumped to 97%. So the reality? These acts are deeply, deeply premeditated. And their motivations? They're all over the map, ranging from a twisted desire to save the world to simply, seeking notoriety.
And when you break down the demographic data, it reveals a pretty stark reality. 52% of attackers were actually unemployed. 44% had a history of serious depression, and 39% had a history of substance abuse. Yet, and this is super interesting, almost half of them actually had some form of a college degree. So rather than being these suave, hyper-competent, evil masterminds you see in spy thrillers like James Bond, many attackers are actually deeply troubled individuals. They're often struggling with severe mental health issues, social isolation, or substance dependency.
Okay, Section 4, Evolution of Lethal Tactics. Let's examine how the actual tools of the trade, the weapons and methods used to carry out these plots, have shifted over time.
Now, when we contrast something like Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle with John Wilkes Booth's tiny little Derringer, a really fascinating historical reality starts to emerge. Despite the cinematic appeal of the lone sniper perched up on a rooftop, concealable handguns, like Booth's, have actually been far more common. In fact, one major study found handguns were used in 51% of major incidents, compared to just 30% for rifles. And if you think about it, why?
Well, because long-range shooting presents massive real-world difficulties. Finding a clear line of sight, positively identifying the target, and then actually scoring a lethal first-round hit from hundreds of meters away, it's incredibly hard. So concealability and getting up close almost always win out in practice.
But when actual nation-states get involved, the tactics change dramatically. Sometimes state actors utilize bizarre, highly deniable methods. A totally wild but perfect example is the notorious KGB poison umbrella tactic. They used this on a Bulgarian dissident named Georgy Markov. Basically, a microscopic pellet containing ricin was injected into his leg using a specially designed umbrella, right out in the open on a busy street. The goal here isn't just to eliminate the target, it's to do the whole shebang in a way that provides complete plausible deniability for whatever government orchestrated the hit.
Section 5. The Targeted Killing Debate. We are now heading straight into the realm of modern international law to grapple with the highly debated, totally gray area between an assassination and a targeted killing.
So this whole debate ultimately hinges on legal framing. On one hand, assassination is universally defined as unlawful murder. It is strictly prohibited, full stop. However, on the other hand, we have this newer concept of a targeted killing, and governments argue that this is actually a lawful act of self-defense against unlawful combatants or terrorists. The friction lies entirely in whether a specific lethal action falls into the category of a literal crime or if it counts as a justifiable military action. To really understand both sides of this, we've got to look directly at the arguments. Proponents, like former federal judge Abraham Sofaer, firmly argue that targeted killings, when done in self-defense, fall completely outside the legal prohibition of assassination. They view it as an absolutely essential legal tool. As Sofaer points out, sure, officials can't just go around killing people merely because their policies are annoying or detrimental. But striking back against an active, ongoing threat, in this view, that's a completely legitimate and necessary defense mechanism for any nation. On the other hand, we have to look at organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union who strongly condemn the practice. They argue that executing individuals far away from any traditional war zone, completely without charge or trial, straight up violates due process and international law. They raise a huge concern here, that these kinds of policies effectively turn the entire globe into a battlefield, stripping away fundamental human rights all in the name of security. And sitting right at the center of this massive debate is a highly advanced piece of technology, the Predator combat drone. Unmanned aerial vehicles like these, which are capable of launching Hellfire missiles from literally miles up in the sky, are frequently used by nations like the US and Israel in asymmetric warfare. Now, this tech is a game changer because it allows for strikes across the globe without ever risking a pilot. But it also physically distances the attacker from the target, which, as you can imagine, heavily intensifies those legal and moral debates we were just talking about, especially regarding civilian casualties and due process.
Finally, Section 6, Shields and Countermeasures. Let's explore exactly how high-profile figures adapt and actually try to protect themselves from these ever-evolving threats.
Because as attackers adapt, you better believe the defenses do too. Leaders employ varied, deeply layered protections. Step 1 is definitely the most traditional, employing bodyguards to act as lookouts and, quite literally, physical human shields. Step 2 involves heavy machinery. We're talking heavily armored vehicles and thick, bulletproof glass to thwart explosives and gunfire. And then Step 3 is all about avoidance and misdirection. This means either going into total seclusion or even using surgical body doubles. Seriously, that's a tactic reportedly used by leaders like Fidel Castro just to confuse potential attackers.
Today, these modern countermeasures have become highly visible, almost totally integrated into public life. Take Pope Benedict XVI, for example, who traveled in a heavily modified armored popemobile. This specific type of vehicle, encased in a literal bubble of clear bulletproof glass, was actually designed specifically after an assassination attempt on a previous pope. It perfectly highlights this constant underlying tension that public figures face. They have this deep need to be seen and to connect with the public, but that has to be weighed against the absolute necessity of just surviving the very real threats we've explored today.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. In the 21st century, where exactly is the line drawn between a legitimate act of war and an illegal assassination? As drone technology continues to advance and combatants increasingly just blend in with civilian populations, how do we ultimately define that boundary between national self-defense and straight-up unlawful killing? It's a massive question, and honestly, it's one that lawyers, politicians, and historians are going to be wrestling with for decades to come. Thanks so much for joining me today. I really hope this look into the anatomy of an assassination has empowered you with a much deeper understanding of this incredibly complex topic.